All right, we're back with the second part of Triad Wars 3, Round 1. And so I'm just going to jump right into the four players that are playing this time. So first we have Chicony versus Albedo. Again, I'm showing this in the order the games were played, not to there's no hints of what's going to happen based on the order I show them. So Chicony goes first. Chicony is the hand in blue. One thing I thought was interesting about Chicony's hand is he clearly felt less need for directional balance than some other players' hands do. You know, he has an A in every direction, which some players, like Piggyman last time, we saw very clearly intending to do. Other players did not do. But the directional balance has more repetitive numbers towards some directions than a lot of other hands do, right? There are 3 upward 6s, and then which is the second best number upwards. There's also a 5 upwards. So really relying on a Dia as the sole upwards power. Now, some of the other cards have effects going upwards, certainly, right? There are multiple double numbers facing up to counter A's there. But in general, it struck me as a hand not that worried about directional balance and number variation, which I thought was really interesting and was curious to see how it would play out. So Chicony started with Zidane in 3, and the AI went with 3998 and 1. And you can see with Chicony's starter, it is well supported by his hand, has multiple ways to take back from both 2 and 6, and the recapture with Kuros in 2 can also be recaptured multiple ways from 1. So a well-supported starter, but does direct the game a little upwards. And I thought 3998 was a nice rejoinder in 1, and made it a little tricky to figure out what to do. The opponent does not have our play covered in 6, so one thing to do would be block 2, but as well as the upwards weakness, now there's a potential sort of downward weakness in Chicony's hand, where the highest number there is an 8, followed by a 7 and a 6. So no block in 2 would have particularly high outfacing value. And as you can see, the hand's much stronger side to side than up down. So the question's going to be, can Chicony make the game more turned side to side than it is turned up down? Or at least that's one question that came to mind for me watching. I think Chicony made an interesting move here and really reminded me of Piggy's game, which I had just watched, where he started with a corner, was met by an adjacent corner, didn't really have a comfortable way to handle it, and went in the center as a way to sort of clarify the position and force the action. And Chicony had the same instincts here. Setting up, losing Waka as a recapture for 6, but gaining Kuros there, setting up Kuros in 4, and, making 2 into a very important square here, which can be occupied safely by him with Kuja if needed. It also does set up the opponent AI to have a plus in 6. They previously did not have a capture of that. But I think it ends up doing just enough to get to a tie. There are a couple ways the AI can play it that are pretty compelling here. Something like Ramza in 4 could be a little awkward, because if Chicony wants to go in 2, he either has to play Kuja, which doesn't capture the card in 1, or he has to play something that's vulnerable to being comboed because it doesn't have a strong enough outfacing towards both Zidane and Waka to be safe. And I think Kuja 2 would tie there, and there might be other ways to tie, but I think the other moves there would actually be losing. A DS7 looks also like a reasonable reply. The AI ends up occupying 2, which also makes a ton of sense. And here, again, a little tricky. I don't think any moves in 8 work. I think the T's are not very good because red will have first access to 4 or 6, which means they can set up to have the combos there. And it is less valuable for Chicony to also have combos there. And Chicony has better stuff in those squares, right? Kuros goes in both 4 and 6 nicely. But because the second turn player will have faster access, I think it will turn out poorly. Chicony nicely, I think, goes in 6. And we head pretty directly to a tie here. And I don't think there was much different to do here. A couple different lines leading to the same results. An interesting first game. I think it's curious that both times we've seen a corner met by an annoying adjacent corner, both times the reaction has been in 5. And both of those games, the player has sort of steered the game towards a tie, though in Piggy's game, the opponent made a late mistake and he managed to sneak out the win there. This one, no win, and we move on to game 2. So here, again, so Chicony has changed his hand. This is the first time a player has changed their hand. And again, the directional balance struck me as really interesting. And I don't mean this as criticism. Like, I love seeing people do different things. But this struck me as a hand unconcerned with explicit downward power, right? Its highest number downward is an 8, then a 7, then a couple 7s, a 6, a 3. You know, much less power downward than in other directions. And relatively weak to the right as well. And, you know, not super strong to the left. Every direction but up, there's kind of like an A or an 8 is the best, and then the next number is, you know, a bit of a drop-off. Just struck me as a curious hand building that was... What I think you'd argue here is that pure strength is not necessarily what matters, because a lot of that can be covered up with card synergy, or with the ability to plus wall stuff. So 6, 7, 8, 7 has the most power he has facing downwards, but it can handle 9s. He has a lot of double numbers facing down that can handle 10s. The A7, 7, 5 cards with the 7, 5 part can do a lot of handling of 8s. And so I think the argument with this kind of hand would be, these are powerful enough cards that can work well enough together that they can handle numbers collectively that individually they might not be able to add up to overpowering. But I thought it was very interesting hand construction here, and while Dalamar was probably the most original hand maker here, going for a lot of up-down cards and left-right cards rather than any corner cards, this struck me as the second most interesting hand build of the round. And we see it over 2 games. It's also possible that the format of cards, Chicony picked out cards he liked and would have, you know, gone in more detail were this tournament with a better way to look at all the cards at once. I don't know. But again, thought it was interesting. I don't mean to influence. I don't think this is particularly criticism or anything. I just thought this looks like a different way to build hands than what I'm used to seeing. And that's always worth looking at and thinking about the merits and disadvantages of. So the opponent again starts with 3, 9, 9, 8, and 1, though this time they go first. And Chicony has this really nicely covered from 2, so I really like the instinct of playing in the other adjacent corner against the side you can play well against, making it hard for the opponent to go in the in-between square of 4. Chicony also, this is pretty clearly with his hand, a very well-supported starter with both Lulu and Fang covering it, and makes a lot of sense for a number of reasons. The opponent ends up flipping and blocking in 4, which gives Chicony a number of options, you know, multiple L's here. I think ends up choosing the best L, and this position looks pretty terrible for red. Though as Chicony pointed out, they actually did have a tie, but it's quite hard to find. And weirdly, they end up playing the first move of the tying sequence. Kind of brilliant find, though I think it found it for weird reasons, and he was worried that this was just going to be an unbeatable AI, because this is quite a move to find tying. Very awkward looking, doesn't look like it achieves much, but like in every line gets just that barely enough to hold on to the tie. And the key is, after Chicony's move, as he pointed out after the game, the opponent had a save with 9, 2, 8, 9, and 3, which the AI did not find, but would have been a cool way to save the game, setting up Hugo in 6 and in 2. The AI misses it. I'm kind of spoiling results of games as I talk, but I'll try to do that less in future rounds. And Chicony pulls out the win. I think 2 nicely played games by him. One where his sort of plan setup starter didn't really match up well with their natural reply. And then the second game, their plan starter didn't line up well with his planned reply, and he found a way to make a safe tie in the first game and to win comfortably in the second. But they did have that creative escape, which he, to his credit, spotted the whole way. So our next game was Wavey versus Rude. Wavey, a hand looking a little more like Dalamar's kind of hand, with these 2 parallel up-down cards that play off each other in Faye and Sarah. Then has another card in the hand named Sarah, another player choosing to use a rare AA corner. We did see a lot of these, actually. I was surprised by quite how many we saw. And Frog and 9848, we'll sort of see how they play out the hand in this game, how they fit. But, yeah. So he starts with Faye and 5, which sets up, obviously, a lot of stuff for Sarah, right? These are 2 cards that are going to play well off each other, and the more one is centralized, the better the other will play throughout the game. And the opponent went for their strongest supported corner. Though Wavey does have this really well covered, perfectly covered from 4. And covered from 8 too. And of course, if you don't have the double capture in 8, and you can only capture one of the things at a time, the one you want to be able to capture is always going to be the corner. You're going to have access to 5 from other directions. So pretty well covered, and now Wavey, kind of looking for a move, doesn't need to immediately address their move, so is likely to play in one of the distant squares of 2, 3, or 6. And I tend to think of 3 as a square to go in if I can set stuff up or have something easy for me to recapture. And so you could imagine something like maybe frog in 3, right? Where Sarah has the same in 2 to go along with the same in 4, and would at least be able to over capture in 6. And then I tend to think of 2 and 6 as moves that set up to control space, where if I go in 2 or 6, like if I go in 2, I'm usually thinking, okay, I want to make sure they don't have a safe move in 1 or in 4. And there are a number of moves in 2 that could do that, and I thought, something like frog in 2 I thought was very possible, though it does set up Riku in 3 really well for the opponent, though of course we might have Sarah in 6 after, depending on the line. But I liked Wavey's move, and it went in a kind of different line of thinking than the one I typically justify these J setup moves with, which was 9, 8, 4, 8, and 6, which plays really well with the other Seraph, the rare Seraph, 4, 1, AA, in both 3 and 9. So it's not denying the opponent's safety, which is normally the first thing I look for in Js, but it is making sure we have one card for the paired squares of 3, 9, that whichever one it goes in is going to be really strong. In 3, it's going to be completely safe. In 9, they do have a way to capture it, but it will lock in the card in 6, and if they do capture it, we'll have the combo back in 4. So I liked this move. Even though it surrendered safety, it ends up leading to a pretty dangerous position for the second turn player, where any move they do in 8 is crushed by Sarah in 4, so they have to look to other squares. Now, there are a lot of ties in the other squares, but the AI didn't end up finding it. Wavey, like Chicony, pointed out after the game, they really should have tied this one. But they end up going in 8, which is the obvious square to go in. It locks in 9, it takes up a square that looks really valuable, and from here, Wavey wins very easily. So a nice game by Wavey, and another center starter, which we didn't see too many non-corner starters this round, but I liked the ones we did see. And here was, I think, our first center starter of the round. So spoilers, we will see another. Our 7th game was Brenn versus Big Joe. Brenn decided to go all FF7. He has not been taking hand building all that seriously. It's just fun for him to get a chance to play Triple Triad again. And here he went, let's just do all FF7 cards and have fun with it. But, typical kind of hand construction. He picks a good card for each corner. He picks sort of a backup card that can plus wall his intended starter. I think this is very reasonable, kind of 4-corner build of a hand. And it's also the first hand we actually see with any A8 corners at all. Piggy's the only other player to use A8s, but he was using A7, A4s, verticals and horizontals. Well, Brenn is our first player to go for pure A8 corners. So he starts with Sephiroth in 7, which is pretty well supported by the hand, has multiple ways to recapture from 8, and can overpower from 4. Now, potentially that's a little vulnerable because the opponent can combo back in 1 with Chrono, potentially, but to force the action, the opponent would have to have a threat in 8, and they do not have that threat right now. So if I was the opponent, I might be thinking about how to set up against 8, potentially going in 9, but I'm not actually seeing any obvious setups. 6, 8, 8, 7, and 9 does set up Garnet in 8, but I don't like using 6, 8, 8, 7 that early if I'm directing the game downwards. It seems like it's going to be a pretty useful card in that direction. So I'm not sure there's a particularly good setup here. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. And I think this is a pretty tough starter for them to meet. And they end up going with a weak opposite corner. And now Brenn has lots of options. He can start trying to lock in from 4, though whichever card he uses there might have potential use other places, but 4 looks very reasonable. He could start attacking their card because they only have 2 ways to take it back from 2, and one of them is Satan, which can immediately be same-walled from 1, and the other is Vincent, which if Brenn then goes in 5, he could lock Vincent in, and they don't have a way to attack that. So you could imagine some move in 6, like, not sure which card, but something in 6 trying to force them to play 2 and then can react well to anything they could put in 2 seems possible. We can also start building around our starter other ways, and Brenn ends up choosing 8 with the point that Chrono in 4 is covered by Nanaki in 1. They might still be able to get away with that with something in 2 at the end, or it looks pretty dangerous. So they probably can't touch Brenn's starter, and they end up going with Chrono in 9, which looks very reasonable, right? It's safe, it flips a card, you know, this looks strong. But after Brenn's move, and actually after the game, after making the move, he was like, I should have done the other card there, I should have played Nanaki there. To me, Kate Sith makes a little more sense. I thought this was a good move, though I think they're very similar plays. Immediately get safety. It is hard for the opponent to address any of Brenn's cards, right? They've given up their capture in 4 when they used Chrono in 9. They don't have anything they really want to stick in 5, but they do kind of want to block 5 so Brenn's Nanaki doesn't land there. They don't really have a good capture in 2 because Satan can be same-walled by Cloud in 1, and Vincent can be plussed by Cloud in 5. So that all looks very dangerous. Pretty hard to find anything. I think this is just lost. The AI goes in 5, and Brenn cleans up easily. So I think another nice win. Everyone's rolling. And our final game of the round is Turdz. Turdz also uses A8 corners, so only in the final 2 games do we see any A8 corners, the classic Celesteira pairing. And the rest of the hand, we have Zidane fitting out another corner and playing well with Ramza. Ramza has a lot of 5s for Celis and Terra to play off, and the 9 potentially as well. And then the 6886 covers Celis and Terra as corners pretty well. So he looked a bit at the corners. I have some notes from him, and he thought the opponent's hand matched up pretty well with both his intended corner and side possible starters. And so ended up just going for pure synergy in 5 with Terra. The opponent plays in the corner, and he said he was looking for A5, 9-5 in 2 or 8 as a follow-up to his starter, just to have Celis be able to play really well off the 5s and be able to combo it from both sides, and with a high number facing towards 5, that's likely to be really big combos. But here, obviously 8 doesn't make sense, and 2 was sort of appealing, but then he also realized Ramza in 6 gives them some trouble, because they can't take that A from above, and so I just threatened to block in 9, and they don't really have a good card they want to play in 9. You know, something like 8, 6, 7, 8, I can just take and control the bottom row. So if I play Ramza in 6, I threaten to go in 9 next turn, and that's a pretty serious threat. He thought 4 was the AI's best chance here, which makes sense, because if we think about kind of, well, first of all, you know, Turdz could combo back in 8, but that surrenders 9, which also in turn surrenders 8 if they go in 4. But if they go in 4 and Turdz sets up the T or the I guess it's a Z, the T or the Z, the opponent has first access to 8. Turdz will not have first access to that combo. And I think that's one of the key functions of kind of T's, Z's, and Q's, is often they're favorable for the first turn player, but the second turn player has, or an X even, has first access to block the key combo squares. So the first turn player is really going to have threats in more than one place, because the second turn player has first access once the formation is set up, while the second turn player can sometimes get away with having fewer things set up because they have first access to whatever those setups are. The AI ends up doing something it's really done quite often, is my AIs love in these J's going in this diagonal place, and I kind of know why that is, but it's quite strange because humans did not play here nearly as often. AIs play here all the time. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. And here, I really liked what Turdz did. He says he'd already been considering moves in 9, specifically with Celis, against other moves. Seemed like it was winning here. It was. The key is that they can't capture without being comboed, and 6886 overpowers anything in 2 or 4, so as long as those squares are left open, Turdz is going to win. And yeah. Agreed. I think this is a very nice move. Having the combo on the card in 7 means the opponent can't really go in 8. And because we've set up that plus for Bosch, normally that would be their safe card to slide in, but it doesn't work here, so this is going to be a very difficult position. I think it is just a loss. They ended up playing Bosch in 3, I think. There we go. And Turdz takes it. and closes out the game. Really liked this one. Thought this was a very nice game. Turdz wins 6-4. He also said afterwards that it was the most thinking he'd done in a first round so far. And I think it was a pretty complex game that we went through quickly because I'm not doing that detailed analysis on this first round. Sorry. So just some human stats I thought would be fun to gather. We saw 8 human starters. I wonder which one I didn't count because I have 4 corner starters, 2 center starters, 1 side starter. So I must be missing one. So it's probably a corner. So there were probably 5 corners, 2 centers, and 1 side. Just wanted to start getting ratios because I had the feeling that corner starters are clearly the most common in tournaments. But if you ask me, like, what percentage do they happen? I'd have no idea and wanted to start gathering some data. Win, ties, losses. Humans won 8 games, gave up 2 ties, and lost 0 games in round 1. This is, pretty huge performance, 90% overall if we include ties in the win percentage, and suggests that they'll probably do very well in round 2 given the comparative strengths of the next AIs, though I think the next round is going to be much tougher. But I think humans are probably favorite to have between 6 and 8 players advance. Of the cards in hand, I defined corner cards as cards where the 2 strongest numbers on the card were touching and where their total was at least 17. So an A766 I am counting as a corner, but an A676 I am of course not because the 7 is not touching the A. A 9766 I am not counting as a corner card because its combined strongest corner value not that high. Similarly, 8876 I wasn't counting as corner cards. I put those in utility cards. And I put as verticals, horizontals cards with the top 2 numbers being at least 17, but facing in opposite directions. So an A784 could count as a corner. It does have a 17 corner, but it is an 18 vertical or horizontal. So I put that in that category. An A676 is a vertical horizontal, and A594 was another typical version we saw. The favorite card, so we saw a ratio of kind of hands on average had 2 to 3 corners, 1 vertical horizontal, 1 utility, and 1 something else. Something else meaning something from those groups, but people varied what that last card was. And of course we saw some very, offbeat hands, like Dalamar had 3 vertical horizontals, which I mentioned I thought was really interesting and played very well in the game. The favorite cards, there were 4 cards that we saw used 3 times. We saw 3 uses of Adia, we saw 3 uses of Kyros, 3 uses of Lulu, and 3 uses of Zidane. And the favorite card type, buoyed by being Zidane being very popular, but also we saw Fafnir and Ramza, was A955s, along with 8866s, slightly beating out A954s. I thought it was interesting. I think I'll mention this in the next note, but we saw only 1 8876. We saw relatively few A964s. A676s were pretty popular, Kyros, and we saw Cloud, so that should be in the 4 category too. And we saw Kuja. No, that should be in the 5 category. So I can't count. So A766s should also be up there in the favorite card types. Apologies. Terrible stat keeping. So I also wanted to check, how much did people say, I want a hand that at least has 1 A in every direction? So I counted how many A's in different directions people's hands had. So if you have like 5 A's facing up and no A's facing any other direction, that would just count as you had one of the directions covered with an A, right? You had an A facing up, but no A's facing the other directions. So I counted how many of the directions each hand had covered with an A, and they averaged 3.44 out of a maximum 4 A's facing different directions. So maximally they could have had 36 A's facing out in the 9 different hands we saw, and in actuality they had 31, but very clearly showing most, basically everyone had 3 to 4 directions covered with an A, and a majority had all 4, or at least half. I'm not sure the exact ratio, but then I wanted to check how many corners were covered with double numbers. I think some players, like myself early on, didn't feel too much need to cover corners with double numbers because I expected to be able to set up combos with my hands. Later on, I got, well, for me this was lazier, it doesn't mean it is for other people, and started just making sure I had lots of double numbers in my hand so I wouldn't have to worry about rares or other annoying things in corners that I might not be able to set up synergies against. So here they on average had 2.4 of the corners covered with double numbers, meaning, you know, you could have a double number towards the top left, a double number top right, double number down right, double number down left. How many of those 4 did your hand have? I think Tezuka was the only one whose hand had all 4 corners covered with double numbers. But this was clearly less of a priority in hand making than having a 10 facing each direction. And then I also wanted to check how many horizontal or vertical double numbers there were. Like Kyros has a 6 facing up and a 6 facing down. Or Princess Moonbrook has a 7 facing to the right and a 7 facing to the left. So you could have 2 of these covered maximum, horizontal and vertical. And I was curious how frequent these were in hands. And they averaged 1.1 out of a potential 2 in their hand, making it a sort of similar level of priority compared to the maximum available as the double numbers towards corners, but obviously because there are only 2 types of it available, much less frequent overall. Do I have any other stats? Yeah, until the final 2 players, not a single player chose an A8 corner, which I thought was pretty interesting. And Brenn was also, as well as being one of the few A8 corners, was the only user of a 9-7 corner. I also thought it was interesting, A775 saw play. Chicony used 2 of them. I think we may have seen another one somewhere, but no form of A774 saw play, which surprised me a bit because I think those are quite reasonable cards and I thought they were pretty popular. 886s were much more popular than 8876s, and even 8767s ended up seeing more use than 8876s. So perhaps these players weren't players that liked 8876s or chose not to go with them. But I was really surprised by their lack of use because I think they're pretty powerful and I think pretty popular as well. 8866s also, of course, very popular, but I expected them to be used in a similar ratio rather than 8866s being a lot more popular. This might be a small sample thing, but maybe 886s just are much more popular than 8876s. So again, interesting to see what people actually use because I don't think anyone ever counted. 4 AA rares were chosen, making it the 2nd most popular corner type behind A9s, of which we saw 8. And no vertical or horizontal AA rares were used. You know, we didn't see any humans use Emi or Takesis or any of those. The most popular horizontal or verticals were A9s, though we also saw a lot of use of Kyros. And most horizontals verticals were up-down rather than side-to-side. And this was a thing I sort of thought was true while playing, that people tend to like up-down cards a little more than side-to-side. You know, Celis Terra is a popular combo, but it's a little less popular than Fafnir Zidane and much less than Squall Cypher. Of course, A9s are a little more popular than A8s. But in general, cards with A's up and down, I think saw more use than cards with sideways. And I always thought this was just a human bias that would show up. I'm not sure there's any edge to be gained by knowing this, but it might mean that having up-down same numbers is better than side-to-side same numbers. It might mean that like a card like Kyros, 676A, plays a little better than something like Ramses, A676, because Kyros' 6s are going to be more often lined up against A's, because up-down A's, I think, are a little more common. I didn't actually do the count here, and I probably should have. So that's all I got for round 1. Hope you enjoyed the games. I'm happy to state that everyone advanced, and in round 2, we'll see if that can continue. I think there's a decent chance, though I think there's also a very good chance of people going out. I should have a betting table of, like, how many people do you think will advance, you know, and have odds on, you know, various things. I think round 3 will be the really tough one. The round 2, you can definitely get a very tricky opponent and get a tough spot, and very losable round coming up. So the rule set's going to be levels 3 through 5. Your total level has to equal 19, which means I think there are only 3 combinations of levels that get you there. So you could go 4 level 4s and a level 3. You could go a level 5, 2 level 4s, and 2 level 3s. Or you could go 2 level 5s and 3 level 3s with no level 4s at all. I'm going to guess in advance that most people will go for the middle option and have some of each level, rather than the first option, which is no level 5s, or the last option, which is no level 4s. I don't want to say too much about what I would be biased to do, but in a previous video, I did talk about what I think the relative strength of levels 3, 4, and 5 are. and my bias would be to get as many as I can of the level that I think is the biggest jump over the previous kind of thing. And the other rule, though, that may change that a lot is you may not use the number 3. So no 6-6-3-2s on level 3, which is generally thought to be the best level 3 card. No 7-6-3-2s or 7-6-3-4s on level 4, which is generally the most popular level 4 combinations. No 6-7-6-3s or 7-7-4-3s on level 5. So hopefully I'm eliminating the most popular stuff, and we'll see what people can do without that. If you're a player, Dalamar in the main spreadsheet has put up a list of all the legal cards, so you can check there more easily to just look at which cards are allowed, and hopefully that will prove useful. So good luck to everyone in round 2. Excited to see what happens. I got kind of tired doing 8 whole games in one round, but I liked how every single game turned out, and I'm curious to see what'll happen, and hopefully I can do a better job of spreading out when people play, so I'm not tired of moving around graphics all at once. Cheers!